Hey everybody, it's Eric from EPAutos.com, your libertarian car guy. Just got off the radio with my friend Brian Hyde, and we briefly touched on the social contract. You probably heard that term before. I've always been fascinated by it in that every contract, as far as I can tell, that I've ever been a party to in my life is something that I entered into voluntarily and had the option to not enter into. For example, when I bought my first house, I agreed to the mortgage contract. I put my name on the piece of paper. I didn't have to. I was given the opportunity to look at the documents, to read them, to decide for myself whether I wanted to do that. And then I decided yes, and I put my signature on the piece of paper, at which point I was legally bound by that contract. It seems entirely reasonable. Now, the social contract thing is entirely different. It seems that you're bound by it just by dint of having been born, which is just such a bizarre concept on so many levels. The first one, obviously, the idea that a child, a baby, can somehow consent is something the law formally rejects. A 5-year-old can't consent to anything. That's why we have the age of consent. So, the idea that you have consented to this social contract just by dint of having been born is absurd on the face of it. And then we get into the second thing, which is that you're never presented with the contract. Let's say you reach the age of majority, whatever that is, let's say 18. And at the age of 18, the government says, look, here's the contract. This is the deal. If you want to be a member of this society, this is the contract. You're free to sign it, or you're free to not sign it. We can get into whatever the consequences of that might be if you don't sign it. But anyway, the point is that you're never given the opportunity to say, no, I don't consent to this. I'm not interested in signing on to this contract. But you're bound by it. So somehow you're bound by a contract that you never saw and that was never presented to you just because the government, that is authority, says so. That's a really, really weird concept. Now, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of it. I think, it's not said openly, but really what it comes down to is that they tell you that you are bound by other people. So, for example, really good one, I think, that gets this point across. You're required to buy insurance, car insurance, if you want to drive, on the theory that you might wreck, and if you do wreck, you might impose costs on society. Notice all those mights, those hypotheticals. And for that reason, we are going to force you to hand over money. Now, there's so many fallacies and non sequiturs in that it almost beggars my ability to articulate it. I prefer a different kind of contract. How about this one? How about we as individuals are held responsible for what we do and left alone when we don't do anything that results in harm or damage to other people? And we are not able to offload the consequences of our, let's say, poor decisions onto other people because there isn't this so-called social contract that imposes those costs on other people who had absolutely nothing to do with it. Right now, if you have a car insurance policy, you're forced to buy it. You're forced to pay higher rates because there are people out there who've chosen to buy ridiculously expensive vehicles, $70,000 trucks, $100,000 EVs. So, if they get dinged in a parking lot, it'll cost $10,000 to repair the thing. Well, they chose to do that, but somehow you're bound by their choice. There's so many examples of this. I'd like to see getting back to a society in which each of us as individuals, we're held responsible for what we do and not for what we don't do, and other people are held accountable for what they do. That would be this weird concept called freedom. And this is parenthetical or sort of related to it. I was going to get into this with Brian, but we never had the chance to continue the discussion. You may have heard about this small community of people who happen to be white people that they decided they want to form their own community where only other white people are allowed to live. And oh my God, you'd think somebody had been talking about pedophilia. But whatever happened to free association? I understand that a lot of people don't like the idea of, looking at people in terms of their race. Like, they don't want to associate with other people who happen to be black or Asian or whatever the case may be. But my God, free association. Why shouldn't you be free to associate or not associate with whomever you like? That used to be an accepted tenet of a free society. Unfortunately, it no longer is on account of the Civil Rights Act. And interestingly enough, it only applies one way. Again, black people can have their own black clubs. They can have their own black magazines. Very explicitly, there's the Black Entertainment Channel, for crying out loud. But you could imagine what the outcry would be if there was something called the White Entertainment Channel. And again, I am not advocating for any of those things other than saying they have every right to do that. I remember when I was in college, there was a black fraternity. Well, who cares? If they want to have a black fraternity, that's fine. I'm not interested. Not only am I not interested in joining it, I'm not interested in forcing myself on, on a group of people who don't want me. Isn't that an odd thing? Isn't that a really weird thing? Why not form your own club? They did that to the Boy Scouts too. It wasn't enough to have the Girl Scouts. It wasn't enough that they could have their own club and their outfit. They had to force themselves onto the Boy Scouts. Ugh, it's just deeply aggravating, and it has led to this just endlessly pecking at you, control freak society that we live in, where you can't just mind your own business, leave other people free to mind theirs, and everybody pursues happiness, as Jefferson used to say. Instead, we're all just kind of aggravated and tense because it's like everybody who's out there is a potential annoyance, or worse than an annoyance, and it all has to do with ultimately the government being the bully boy that backs it all up. Just some thoughts for the day. More over at epautos.com, the web's best libertarian gearhead site. We'll have more for you again soon.